All right, again, welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone had a good, safe, somewhat smoke-free summer this year. And look, it was free smoke, right? Sorry, I had that wrong. So, but hopefully we have some clear skies coming up. So we got a great lineup tonight. So we have a double feature with two guest speakers tonight on two super interesting topics. So we'll move on to our guest speakers now. And just again, the agenda today is we'll do a guest speaker. We'll have some announcements just before the break. And then after the break, we'll have Warren Finlay with his Hershel 2500. So Sharon, if I could ask you to please come up and introduce our first guest speaker.
Okay, thank you. It's really fantastic to have Robert Smith here today. Some of you who've been in the club for a while probably remember him giving talks in the past, and it's nice to have him back here. Dr. Smith is a professor in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta, which might sound a little bit unusual, but he is a specialist in the history of science and technology. And he actually has a physics background. And for those of you who know what this means, he did the mathematical tripos at Cambridge, which is a big deal, actually. But then decided to go into history. He could probably tell us more about how he got interested in that sometime. But he's working right now on a history of the James Webb Space Telescope. And so I'm going to ask him to come up here and tell us more about that. Oh, here he is.
So thank you, Sharon. And some of my colleagues think I'm a semi-madman because I've been working on a history of something that, in their view, has not happened. But it's now happened. It's actually working successfully. And so they look at me differently by this point. But for 2 decades, because I started doing serious research on the history of the James Webb Space Telescope back in 2002, when construction had not actually got underway. So what I'm going to do tonight is look at a few what I call key moments in the history of JWST. And to get us underway, though, we're going to take a very long run to get started on the history of JWST. And we're going to go back to the 30th of August, 1905. And the reason for this, I hope, will become obvious. Let me, as my first puzzler, ask what significant things happened in science in 1905? Special relativity, Brownian motion, quantum theory. So we have Einstein's annus mirabilis, but we also have something else, which I will be speaking about any moment. A bit larger, and this is what is often called the single galaxy universe. And this is almost universally the position of astronomers in 1905. So all of the nebulae, it turns out, in 1905, that you can see, they're within our own Milky Way system. The Andromeda Nebula is indeed a nebula. It's not an external galaxy. So that's 1905. And subsequent developments between then and 1923 pointed to the fact that maybe some of these objects that were classed as nebulae might be external galaxies. But the clinching moment comes almost exactly 100 years ago, which is the reason why I was going to start with this tonight. I expect some of you know what that clinching moment is. It's Edwin Hubble discovering a Cepheid variable in the Andromeda Nebula. And he detects it in October 1923. Takes him a few months to get the light curve. He thinks initially it's a nova, but in fact, it's a Cepheid because he's able to draw the light curve, gets a distance of 900,000 light years. The biggest version of our galaxy was about 300,000 light years in diameter. So clearly, the Andromeda Nebula is a galaxy beyond our own Milky Way system. And within a very, very short period, opinion swings, and now our universe is full of a myriad of galaxies. And not only that, just a few years later, it's established the universe is expanding. These galaxies are almost all receding from us. Okay. Okay. So that's what I would have said at the beginning. There's a well-known book by the astronomer Agnes Clark, called The System of the Stars. And so what she's doing is arguing this is our universe here. So we have the nebulae, here are the stars, and the nebulae are part of our own stellar system. And when Hubble makes his discovery of the Cepheid in the Andromeda Nebula, he's making use of the largest telescope of the time. That's a Mount Wilson 100-inch, the Hooker reflector on Mount Wilson. So there's the famous plate. Hubble has found an object which he marks initially as an N, but then it becomes a VAR exclamation mark. Initially, it's a nova, but he realized it's a variable. But the key thing with the Cepheid, you can get an accurate distance with the Cepheid. And he makes use of the period luminosity relationship, established, of course, by Henrietta Leavitt, 1912. And this is absolutely fundamental to the astronomy of the early 20th century, because it's using Leavitt's period luminosity relationship that enables Harlow Shapley to argue that our own Milky Way system is much larger than anybody had realized, and our own sun is displaced from the center. So we have this enormous transformation in astronomy early in the 20th century, which is in large part driven by big telescopes, like the Mount Wilson 100-inch. But these are telescopes that are restricted to only a very small number of astronomers. If you're on the staff at Mount Wilson, you can use the Hooker reflector. If you're not on the staff, you can't use it. So it's a very different sort of astronomy to the astronomy we have today. So let me now then swing over to the James Webb Space Telescope, and the basic outlines I expect everybody's more than familiar with by this point. But we have the 6.5 meter mirror, we have the sunshade, the telescope is out beyond the moon and a thermal environment that's a lot more stable than if the telescope was orbiting around the Earth. And the history of the James Webb Space Telescope really reaches back even to the 1980s, although serious construction of it began in about 2002. And so I will touch on very briefly some key issues here. I mean, how do you move a conception for a very big, powerful telescope from a conception in somebody's head, something on a drawing board, into a working telescope? And you need an awful lot of people to be involved to build the telescope, build the scientific instruments that will be accompanying the telescope. You will need lots and lots of astronomers to be involved in making observations, and a typical group of astronomers making observations with the JWST numbers about 50, sometimes 100 or even more astronomers. So this is a completely different enterprise to the sort of thing Edwin Hubble was doing back in 1923, where it's him at the telescope making his observations, analyzing his data. So why do some telescopes get selected, others not? Well, if you want to put things into space and do astronomy, it's going to cost a lot of money. But the launch of Sputnik in 1957 transforms the prospects of getting telescopes above the Earth's atmosphere, because we have Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Sputnik is launched October 1957. It's seen as a grand triumph for the Soviet Union, and the United States has to respond. Now, the main response, of course, will come with the manned spaceflight program, in particular the Apollo missions to the moon. But there's also an enormous effort to support scientific research in space, including doing astronomy from space. And before this time, there were various opportunistic efforts by astronomers, flying balloons to get very high in the atmosphere. This, as some of you I'm sure will recognize, is an X-15 experimental airplane being dropped from beneath a B-52 bomber. Sometimes they carried an ultraviolet spectrograph behind the pilot to make observations, astronomical observations. As well as flying balloons, there were rocket flights. Maybe you get 5 minutes of observing time above the atmosphere. So if you have a combination of a balloon and a rocket, what do you get? A raccoon, exactly. Yes, it's not hard. So there are now enormous federal funds that will go towards astronomy from space. And so we have a switch from the private support early in the 20th century, people like Andrew Carnegie supporting the Mount Wilson Observatory, to federal monies. Now, of course, in American astronomy, you still have, even today, lots of private funds going to ground-based astronomy, but not space astronomy. As space astronomy tends to be at least an order of magnitude more expensive than ground-based astronomy. And if you've been giving presentations for NASA in the 1960s and 70s, you may well have used this chart, which versions of which, of course, I'm sure is familiar to you. But it just illustrates which wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation actually reach the ground. And obviously, one of the things that happens with space astronomy is it opens enormously the possibilities of what you can do. You can now do X-ray astronomy, for example. You could not do that earlier because the X-rays don't make it to the ground, to telescopes on the ground. And so astronomy is transformed, really, I think, in the 50s and 60s by this access to this enormous range of wavelengths, building on what had already happened from the ground with radio telescopes. And the big promise in the 1970s was a large telescope, a telescope in the 1970s anyway, comparable to the biggest ground-based telescopes. And that was going to be what would be later called the Hubble Space Telescope. And Hubble here has a 2.4 meter mirror. Let me remind you, and so there's the mirror. There's Hubble in a clean room at the Lockheed Missiles and Space Company in 1988. Then we have key moment number 3 that will come in 1989, and that is actually planning what would succeed Hubble. This is what was called at the time the next generation space telescope. Hubble had not been launched yet, but already people are planning what comes after Hubble. And there are even ideas of putting big telescopes on the moon, like this thing here, which is going to have a 16-meter mirror. This is a space version, 10-meter mirror. This is a very short-lived space initiative. You can recognize, I think, President Bush the first. And we have the head of NASA and the Apollo 11 astronauts at this signing, arguing, okay, let's go back to the moon. That initiative lasts about 3 months. Then it's dead. But this idea of a next generation space telescope is now in play. Moment 4, launch of the Hubble Space Telescope. And there it is being deposited into space. And it is spherical aberration time, as I'm sure many of you can remember. And so that is a star image that has been messed up by spherical aberration. And the telescope, the Hubble Space Telescope, now becomes this national embarrassment, which means that you cannot expect to build a successor to Hubble while Hubble is in this difficult state. Success brings success and failure brings failure fundamentally. And so we have the telescope there doing an eye test, for example. And so it, for a period, is a national embarrassment. So Hubble is a joint enterprise of NASA and the European Space Agency. James Webb is a product of NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, and the European Space Agency. So Hubble does not have that kind of Canadian connection, but we'll be getting on to the Canadian connection. My favorite example of imagery associating Hubble with failure is this. Let's see if we can get this to go. So we're off to the blues bar in Naked Gun 2.5. If you're depressed, you go to the blues bar.
I'm feeling blue. Just
And if you notice the pictures on the wall,
I get out of bed.
they're all disasters, basically.
Wish I was
So we have the
dead.
Hindenburg, the Titanic,
And I hope you do too.
that's Michael Dukakis. He was a very bad American presidential candidate in 1988.
I've taken all the pills the law will allow, and so I'm feeling blue.
Sir,
What else can I do?
give me the strongest thing you got.
Or a gun would get the job.
On second thought, how about a Black Russian?
Very well, sir.
I guess I'm just screwed.
Frank, I thought I'd find you here.
Dad, sit down. Pull up a memory or two.
And there's the Hubble
Before
Space
I could
Telescope.
talk to you.
Ed,
Okay.
is it just my imagination, or is the whole world crazy?
No, it's just a small percentage of the population, Frank.
And things can only get better after that. And so this is the launch of the shuttle 1993. It's basically a repair mission to Hubble. And big telescopes get lots of presidential interest. This is another fundamental rule here. Anybody guess how much has been spent on Hubble to this point? 2023. Anybody want to make an estimate? How much money has been spent on Hubble? It's depending on who you believe, and I believe my figures, it's about 25 billion. It is the single most expensive scientific instrument ever built. So anyway, we have President Clinton and Vice President Gore talking to the crew that have visited the Hubble. And Hubble is fixed, it turns out. and it's performing at least as well as was planned before the launch. And I won't go into lots of detail. We have, of course, the pillars of creation, comet or chunks of comet Shoemaker-Levy smashing into Jupiter. And these images transform Hubble's image from this hopeless, miserable failure, this fiasco, into a technologically superior demonstration of what can be done by the United States along with Europe. And the telescope becomes a celebrity, I think you can say. And when I give my history of astronomy classes at the University of Alberta, I normally have one of these fine items with me, and I ask the students to guess what it is. I'm afraid I go for the socks every time, but anyway. So, Hubble's now a success, which opens space for a successor to Hubble. If the repair mission had not worked, we would not be here, I think, talking about a James Webb Space Telescope. But it is a success. And so there are lots of efforts by astronomers in the 1990s to define, okay, what should we do next? In particular, what should we do next in space? And the big area that people see as extremely important is the infrared region of the spectrum. And so this is a report put together by literally hundreds of astronomers in the 1990s, early 1990s, and they call it the decade of the infrared. Another committee meets in the mid-90s and makes this argument, what should NASA do next? They should build a big infrared observatory. The head of NASA actually gives a speech at the American Astronomical Society in 1996. So this is a history going back a long way, as I say. And what he argues for is an infrared telescope, but he tells the astronomers they're being too modest. They argued for a mirror 4 meters in diameter. But what the head of NASA is arguing for, he says, you're being too restricted. Think bigger. Go for 6 or 7 meters. And not surprisingly, he gets a standing ovation after this talk. And so the design efforts get underway. And so we see a very early design here. We can already see we've got the sun shield. We've got the segmented mirror. So that's April 96. And the telescope becomes a kind of anti-Hubble, because the big concern with Hubble, it's cost too much money. So how can we save money? No shuttle is one big way to save money, because the cost of a shuttle launch, by $1 billion, yeah, in round numbers, is simply too expensive to go and repair Hubble. So moment 6, the project's underway. And there's a contract that's issued to the Northrop, well, it's initially TRW, but TRW gets taken over by Northrop Grumman, and it's less than $1 billion. And the telescope will end up costing about 10 billion US, that is. So that's 2002, and so now things are actually moving. Okay, but along with lots of technological progress, the difficult technologies are being constructed, but it's taking longer to do things than had been planned, and it's costing a lot more money. And if you're spending money on the James Webb Space Telescope, you can't be spending it on other things. So this is a story that was in Nature, arguably the most prestigious scientific journal, about the telescope that ate astronomy. So this is James Webb Telescope. And the telescope gets zeroed out of the budget. That is, the telescope now faces cancellation. And there will be no James Webb Telescope if this had not been resisted. And so why are people angry at it? It's billions over budget. It's years late. Let's cancel it. But that's resisted by this, in particular by this Senator, Barbara Mikulski. She fights very hard to get the telescope back into the budget, and she's successful. But big scientific projects can fail. The biggest one that has actually been cancelled after, in current dollars, about $5 billion have been spent on it, is a superconducting super collider, or the SSC. That was going to be a 54-mile ring around the town of Waxahachie in Texas. Over budget, years late, it got cancelled. So the superconducting super collider failed. One reason, it had no international partners. Lots of reasons why it failed, but that's one of them. But all the way through the planning for what was initially the next generation space telescope that becomes a James Webb Space Telescope, the idea is to have international partners. And this is something that goes right back to the start of the planning. And so how does Canada get involved? Well, you may think, oh, Space Plan 1, Space Plan 2, these bits of bureaucracy, what do they actually do? But here is a plan for the Canadian Space Agency. They're trying to work out what should be the latest space plan. This is back in 1999. And there are three options that the government is picking between. And initially, they go for this option. But if that option is the one they have to live with, the Canadian Space Agency could not become involved with the James Webb Space Telescope. So the head of the Canadian Space Agency phones John Manley, who we knew, and Manley is a minister of industry, and he talks him into going with the option of $300 million. And that's the one that actually proceeds, and Canada gets involved with James Webb. So, I mean, one of the things in the story of James Webb is all these moments of what you might call contingency. Things could have gone the other way. And here there could have been no Canadian involvement if Manley had said, no, we can't do that. But he didn't. So it changes $300 million a year, and now the main Canadian contribution was the guiders and one of the instruments. And so the telescope's back on track. And see if I can get this to play. So this was a video that was made a couple of years ago, where you see the completed telescope. Okay, maybe I can go forward now. Okay, so to launch, Christmas Day 2021 aboard an Ariane 5 rocket, French Ariane 5 rocket. Moment 9, 11th of July 2022, the first images. And who do you get to be your pitch man for the first images, or the first scientific images from the James Webb Space Telescope? You get the president. As I say, with these really big projects like Webb, like Hubble, when things go well, you accrete politicians. Okay, so there we have Biden applauding the image. And the images of the distant universe full of galaxies. There's a recent galaxy shot or deep, so-called deep field. And again, think back to the first part of the talk, 2023 compared to 1923, when you've only just got the move to the idea that the universe is full of a myriad of galaxies. Here we're seeing galaxies where the light has been traveling for maybe 13.4, even perhaps 13.5 billion years. So it's an utterly extraordinary transformation in that 100 years, I think. Then moment 10, maybe sometime in 2041, who knows for sure. But Webb has been successful, so the chances that you would have a successor to Webb are now very good. And it might be something like, this is obviously an artist's conception. This is what's called a habitable worlds telescope. The principal purpose of which will be to examine the atmospheres of exoplanets. But you can see the basic idea following on from JWST. We've got a sun shield and the segmented mirror, and people have been looking at options between mirrors, maybe 4 meters or even 15 meters, somewhere in that range. So if you're back in 2041, 42, maybe somebody is going to be working on a history of the Habitable Worlds Observatory. But I suspect it's not going to be me. But anyway. Okay. So I don't know if there are any
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. Anyone in the audience have a question? Anyone? All right. How about out in virtual land? Any questions? We're good. No questions out? Okay. All right. Anyone? Oh, we have one over there. Can't escape just yet there.
So a question about Hubble, I guess, what was the life expectancy of Hubble? And then what is the expected life of JWST? How long will it be in space and not have to be serviced there?
Yeah, so Hubble, I mean, I can remember when I was a staff member at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington for 15 years. And I can remember meetings I went to along with colleagues in the 1980s with NASA figures. This is before launch of Hubble. And the idea was that once Hubble's 15-year lifetime was up, the shuttle would go get it and we could put it in the museum. Right. This is before shuttle launches cost $1 billion. Right, so initially the idea was that Hubble would have a lifetime of 15 years, but there was no technical reason for that, really. It was just a number that you can live with, that you can repeat. But clearly Hubble with shuttle launches, and the last one I think was what, 2008-9, has lasted far longer than the 15 years. There was no technical reason why it was 15 years. That was much more of what you might call a political number, because, okay, Hubble's maybe most productive lifetime is up. We should be building the next one. James Webb, because the launch by the Ariane 5 was regarded as absolutely on the money in terms of the trajectory, you're not going to have to expend as much fuel for kind of station keeping as you would have done with a less successful launch. But the launch generally, I mean, people told me that the Ariane 5 had nailed it and that they can get 20 years, they think, out of Webb. But what is always worth paying attention to in these matters is the NASA language is along the lines of we cannot service it with a manned rocket or something, right? Which leaves a lot of room for an unmanned servicing mission. So I would not necessarily rule out Webb going beyond the nominal, what is now a nominal kind of 20 years, if there is some sort of robotic mission that could perhaps service the telescope. But that is not something that people are talking about at this point, but it is, I think, a possibility. So space missions, generally, the rule of thumb is if they last for a year, you could go on for a lot longer. Typically, space missions, if things go wrong, they go wrong early. If you're still operating after a year, then you may have an unlimited time. And the limit will tend to come more politically. It's just costing too much. What's the science return? We can't afford to do this anymore. It's more that kind of argument, I think.
Okay. Oh, we have one more question. Oh. Okay, we'll have one here, and then we have a couple online.
Hi, I was just wondering if you were to give an approximate price range, if you were to say like this is a long time in the future, the Habitable Worlds telescope, but if you were to give like an approximate price range, because it'll probably, in my mind, probably cost more than the Webb telescope ended up. But if you were to give your own, like, I think about this much, what would you say that would be?
I think people, I mean, the people I've spoken to tend to be quite hesitant about that, just because they feel that a lot of the stuff Webb was doing was for the first time. So Webb is an infrared observatory, so it's got to operate in conditions of extreme cold. So the whole telescope is at about 40K. And some of the detectors are at only 7 or 8K. Some of the detectors for the mid-infrared instrument. So you've got to make it exceptionally cold. Testing and figuring out how to test the telescope, given the conditions in space it was going to have to endure, that took a lot of effort. So I think there are some people who are quite gung-ho and say, look, a lot of the stuff we had to do for Webb for the first time, we can now do, and we can learn from Webb in terms of habitable worlds. That a lot of the stuff will be not that dissimilar. The basic issues that we face may be relatively similar. So you saw the segmented mirror on the habitable worlds. Well, we can do that. We can build the actuators for the mirror, because you have this phenomenally complex system of actuators behind. And so the mirror kind of unfolds, as well as we saw in the little video. But then there are other people who say, look, look at history here. The history is that if you have these big telescopes, put them in a class of other observatories of this kind, and the idea that you could build it for 10 billion is probably pie in the sky. It's probably going to be substantially more, because it's being more ambitious. This is going to be almost certainly much bigger mirror. The solar arrays and the sun shield have got to be larger. So this is going to be a really challenging enterprise. So maybe it's going to cost more. But at the moment, really, again, based on conversations I've had with people fairly recently, they're trying to get their arms around what kind of telescope do they actually want, what can they afford, and who's going to be involved with it, and what lessons can we draw from Webb. So that's a Weasley way of saying I don't know. But as I say, I mean, people give me people are hesitant to give me a firm number, but they talk about these kinds of factors that will play into the history or into what the history of the habitable worlds will be. But I think always with these big missions, the clear sense is it's a very fragile enterprise. You need a lot of people to be putting a lot of effort in before you ever get launched. It's going to cost a lot of money to get launched. You're going to have all sorts of problems, and you've got to ride the waves that will inevitably come. And so you need people with the skills, the managerial, political, as well as scientific and technical skills to be able to deal with that. So somehow I think that certainly my undergraduates, when I teach them, they think, oh, these telescopes just kind of turn up. But it's vastly complex, and there's no necessary reason why they turn up. It's an enormous effort of work to get them to turn up and drive astronomy forward. And but what also is, I think, striking is just these enormous advances. And if you go back to 100 years, you see just the phenomenal transformation in the picture of the universe that there's been in this 100 years. And a large part has been driven by these new capabilities like Hubble, like the James Webb Space Telescope.
Okay, I think we have time for just two more, I think, questions out in Zoom land there.
All right, so we have a question here from Gerhard. He basically has two questions. First one is what were the reasons for the multi-year delay? And then his follow-up to that was, why does there always seem to be such a discrepancy between the plan and the reality?
Why the delay? How long do we have? Let me give the extremely short version. Why the delay? I think part of it is if at the start of one of these big federal kinds of federally supported projects, you had a perfect budget profile. That is, you got the money when you wanted it. You could do a lot better. But you get the money that you get. And so the US Congress is on an annual basis. And so the amount of money, and so the main driver is NASA, right? This is, even though it's involving the Canadian Space Agency, it involves the European Space Agency, the principal driver is NASA, and NASA's money comes annually. So some years, money is cut from the budget. Work you had planned for that year has to be postponed. And the rule of thumb that the aerospace managers I speak to tell me, the rule of thumb is if you have a certain amount of work and then you have to postpone it, then you get all sorts of problems, and it's probably a factor of 3 more expensive eventually that you're going to have to pay for that particular work, because you lay people off or they go elsewhere in the company, then you've got to bring them back, and it's just very messy. And so that, I think, that lack of an accurate budget profile is important. People, I think, naturally, when they start off a project, are optimistic, because if you're not optimistic, you're probably never going to start. You know, it's a very human thing to be optimistic. And I can remember back to early meetings I attended, people were gung-ho, oh, we're going to build this and all this kind of stuff. So I don't think they're trying it on. But inevitably early in projects, people are often too optimistic in how long it's going to take, how much it's going to cost, which means that there should be better ways. I mean, if I was sitting there as a policy analyst instead of a historian, I would say, you've really got to have better ways of estimating the costs of these things. Because it tends to be each time one of these really big projects gets underway, it's almost as if a lot of stuff is being invented all over again. Plus, you have contractors who were used to working for the Department of Defense. So Northrop Grumman is the main contractor for the James Webb Space Telescope. They're the main contractor in the defense industry. This is not a big deal for them. Right? But the culture of the company is such that spending over what you had initially been given, you know, it's not a terrible crime. Right? The key, if you're building things for national defense, what is the key thing you've got to get right? Delivery, you've got to deliver as promised. And so you could argue, okay, it's a combination of factors that often lead to these kinds of delays and overruns. But you see it again and again and again. And I don't know how many people have been following the business of Mars, the Mars return samples, but you know, it's kind of classic case where they're not getting the money when they need it, and so things end up costing more. The launch system, Artemis, that is going to take astronauts to the moon, and people are arguing that that is unsustainable in terms of the cost. So cost is clearly an enormously important factor in these sorts of projects. But very bright people have been grappling with this sort of problem for a very long time, and still nobody has really fixed it. I mean, estimating what a big state-of-the-art observatory is going to cost before you start building is hard. Then you throw in the lack of correct budgeting profile. Then you add in the optimism. People can talk themselves into saying, oh, we can do this. If we don't do this, we're going to get cancelled. So if you're asked that by the NASA administrator, can you do this for this amount of money? What's your answer? No, we can't do it, sir. Please cancel us. Right? It's not going to be a totally effective way to proceed. And so maybe I should just stop there and say it is very complex.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. Okay, we have just a couple of announcements to make, and then we'll break for our little break.
Great, thanks, Jay. So, as some of you know, it's been 20 years since the Black Nugget Lake Observatory concept was thought of. And in those 20 years, more than 8 tons of concrete have been poured. More than 2 tons of steel and aluminum have been welded, machined, or installed in making the observatory and telescope. $168,000 in cash donations were gratefully received. $414,000 of in-kind contributions were generously supplied. And more than 10,000 volunteer hours were logged by the Black Nugget Lake Observatory Committee and fellow volunteers. After all that time, effort, and funding, I am very pleased to stand before you tonight and announce that the 32-inch Unit Drew telescope is now completed and installed and operating at Black Nugget Lake Observatory. Thank you. So there it is there. We were lucky enough to have a night in August, as Jeff mentioned, where we actually looked through the telescope, and the views were absolutely astounding. Yeah, I mean, you need to come out and see it and look through it. It's just amazing. We were able to see a couple of the lensed quasars in Einstein's Cross, and the views of the East Veil Nebula were just astounding. So the optics work wonderfully. It's a fantastic instrument. Yeah, so in terms of coming out and getting a look through it, so every night, starting tomorrow night, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, this week, every night, from 9 o'clock to 9 p.m. till 1:30 a.m. we'll be having people operating the telescope, and you can look through it. It's part of Northern Prairie Star Party, so you can register for the Star Party and come out any of those nights. Wednesday night from this week from 7:30 to 9 p.m. we'll have an open house. Anybody can come out and have a look at the telescope in the daylight hours. And then as well on Saturday from noon to 1 p.m. if you want to look at the scope in the daylight hours, you can come out during Northern Prairie Star Party and look at it at that time. And that'll be just before the grand opening at 1:30 on Saturday. If you'd like to help out at Black Nugget Lake Observatory, volunteers are appreciated. You can talk to me after the program, or if you want to get involved with the Management and Operations Committee, talk to Jay. That committee will be struck later this year, so you can talk to Jay about that. I'd like to close by thanking the generous sponsors and donors who've supported this project over all the years. But I'd like to especially thank my fellow Black Nugget Lake Observatory Committee members. In reverse alphabetic order, that's Luca Vanzella, Roman Eunuch, Kent Martins, Alan Hobbs, and Rick and Susan Bram, who have been so dedicated during the construction of the observatory and the Eunuch Drew Telescope. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Looking forward to many nights of using that scope. If I could ask Dave Mussel to please come up. Great segue. Dave is going to talk a little bit about the Northern Prairie Star Party.
Thank you, Jay. I'm here tonight on behalf of Rick and Sue Bram, who couldn't be here. Rick was unfortunately caught up in a medical emergency and is now in hospital. So Ellen and Marion Hobbs and Carol, my wife, and I have been brought in to take over the coordination of the event. And we're doing everything we can to make it happen smoothly. And I can assure you that Susan Bram is very busy and active in behind the scenes, even though she's attending to Rick in the hospital. She's has spent a lot of time helping us get up to speed on all the events that are part of the Northern Prairie Star Party. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Northern Prairie Star Party. So it was first hosted at the Black Nugget Lake some 20 years ago. And so that's kind of an auspicious date. And nice to also know that the telescope has been in the works for that long also. This year's event will run from Tuesday, tomorrow, September 12th, until Sunday, 17th of September. And most of our group activities are planned for Friday and Saturday, the 15th and 16th of September. It's not too late to register and take in the many activities of this year's NPSP. And as a registrant, you are welcome to take in any or all of the planned events from Tuesday through to Sunday in the schedule of the Star Party. And the general information and ground rules, I strongly encourage you to go and look at those. They're on our website. And there's a lot of other information there as well, which I'll refer to. Registration fees are $30 per person or $60 per family. We recommend that you register in advance by emailing the NPSP email, which is, you'll find us a link on our website. And Rick and Susan would normally receive those emails. However, they are all being forwarded to us. So we'll respond on their behalf. So having your registration in advance will help immensely with the planning, and especially with the seating and event planning related to all these things that are happening at the party. You have the option of sending your payment via e-transfer or paying when you arrive on site. There will be camping fees applied in addition to that if you're staying overnight. And details about the camping are also to be found on the website. If you are camping, I just want to remind you that everybody who is registered to camp their names will be supplied to the campground operator, and you'll be required to go enter and leave the campground via the regular gate going right by the office. And as when you first arrive, you'll need to check in with the campground operator to let them know that you were there. They should have your names by the time you arrive. If you are not camping, however, and you are just coming for the day for some of the events or staying for the evening, you are being asked to enter and exit the site via the north gate, which is just a few hundred meters east of the range road that you come into Black Nugget area in on Township Road 492. And if you're wondering where that is, if I haven't been clear, just there is a map on the website that you can look at, and it'll show you exactly where that entrance is. What else do I need to mention? Yeah, when you, back to the point of camping again, once you arrive on the site, you'll check in at the office there and then let them know that you're here. And then you'll be directed to site 98, which is right near the, just across from the cook shack in the campground area. And there you'll find the registration tent and other things that you'll need to like it. There'll be a board with all the events posted on it as well. If you are just coming out for the evening and you want to have a look through the new Unit Drew telescope, you'll be directed to that location by gate attendants at the north gate, and you'll be given directions as to where you can park as well, and which direction to park. And finally, the full details of the program are available on our website. And here's just a few of the highlights. There'll be presentations by Dr. Brian Martin and Dr. Eric Roslowski, both of the University of Alberta, and Warren Finlay, whom you just heard from just a few minutes ago. And there will also be solar observing. There'll be tours of the Black Nugget Lake Observatory, as Warren mentioned. And also there'll be a barbecue, there'll be door prizes, there will be lots of visual observing and lots of people doing astrophotography. And so there should be a lot going on and something for everybody there. We're looking forward to having you this year. And again, for more information, just go to the website. There's an article there that lists everything that we're doing and the times and things that you would need to know, especially for camping and other details. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you out at Black Nugget Lake.
Thank you, Dave. Did we mention 32 inches of a glorious aperture out there? So well worth a visit for sure. I'd like to ask Jeff Robertson to come up, please. This will be our final announcement just before the break.
Thanks, Jay. I'll make this quick. I'm looking for more volunteers. First off, let me thank all of the people that showed up at Elk Island for a smoky, rainy, and cloudy Milky Way day. It's fun, wasn't it, guys? Yeah. Okay. We've got two more events coming up that are posted on our website. One is at Lakeland Provincial Park near Lac La Biche. The details are on our website. It's a Saturday. They're having a star party that runs from 7 to 11. It's going to be at the Shaw Lake Day Use area. This will require an overnight stay, and we will reimburse you for gas, meals, and accommodations. We're looking for 3 or 4 members to go out there and help out. And then on the 25th, which is a Monday, unusual, there is an event at Métis Crossing, which is near Smoky Lake. They're gunning for a dark sky preserve out there, and they're putting on a little star party to give people a feeling of what a dark sky preserve could give them. So we're looking for 3 or 4 members to go out there with telescopes and show off some of the objects in the night sky. Now, at Elk Island, they are having something called Gateway to the Stars, which is 6 events that are going to run in October. And they describe Gateway to the Stars as an introductory stargazing program where park interpreters guide participants using star charts to find some of the major constellations visible in the night sky. What they want us for is to set up telescopes half an hour or so before and maybe a half an hour after they do their program. So people can have a look through a telescope and see some of the stuff they're talking about during their presentation called Gateway to the Stars. And they are looking to go Friday and Saturday, October 6th and 7th. Friday and Saturday, October 13th and 14th. October the 14th is also a partial solar eclipse here, in 10 o'clock in the morning or so. And then the following week, Friday and Saturday, October 20th and 21st. That's all out at Elk Island. Some of our members have done this in the past. We were looking for a few other people who could help out. And they'll let us lug our scopes up to the theater, up through that back road if you're familiar with the area, so you don't have to haul them up from the parking lot. So if you're interested, let me know. My email address is on our website under public education. And that's it. So thank you very much. I have not put the dates for the Gateway to the Stars on the website yet, but I will add that tomorrow morning. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Okay, let's take a quick break. It's oh, come on up. One more announcement on Jasper Dark Sky Festival.
I guess we had to say something because sound like we're going to lose all the possible people. Jasper Dark Sky Festival is running this year Friday, October 20th to Sunday, October 22nd. This is RASC Edmonton Center has been participating in this for the last decade. More than that. It's an important outreach event which showcases our club to a fair number of people. Has an interaction with up to 600 people in a night in the past. I'm not sure we're going to reach those numbers again, but we have reached that in pre-COVID times. And what we need for those 3 days is 10 astronomers and their partners, if available. We need people with a good knowledge of the sky, equipment for both daylight and night astronomy. For solar and you know, something for daytime, such as either white light filters or preferably H alpha and other solar scopes. Equipment of sharing with the public. And one of the things that some of the things that we need also in the people that we're interested in having come out there, enjoyment with working with the public. They have to be able to have a good understanding of the night sky, as we've said. Must be a member in good standing. Membership's paid up. Volunteer experience in hours spent with public is preferred. Must be available for all 3 days and be out there and ready to be set up by about 5 p.m. on Friday. And right now we're unsure whether we're running 2 nights and 1 day or 1 night and 2 day events. So there'll be 1 event a day. So, and they do want us to be there because there are the perks available for the people that are selected to go out are stay at the Jasper Park Lodge this year. Most of the gas and food will be paid, will be reimbursed. And if you have any questions or would like to volunteer, you can see either myself, Alan, or my wife, Marion Hobbs. And you can email to the JDSFC at Edmonton RASC.com email site if you are interested. Does anybody have some questions or why we do this or who they might want to and how they might want to participate? Nope. Good, we did our job.
Also, Chris and Monica Muirveld are also involved, so that you can contact them as well if you have their contact, but that JDSF will go to us all.
Okay. Actually, a very important event for our center, so thank you. Okay, let's break. We'll make it short if we can. Let's try to get back by 9 o'clock, and we'll have another speaker up. Okay. So I don't think our next speaker really needs an introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyways. So as everyone saw in the first half, that Warren has been certainly a part of the Black Nugget Lake Observatory Committee, and he's been head down working on that for the last few years. And but maybe much to some people's surprise, he actually gets some observing in as well, amidst that busy schedule. So he's achieved quite the accomplishment here this year, and that is completing his Hershel 2500 observing list. So please welcome Warren Finlay.
Thanks, Jay. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, so what I'd like to do is talk about the Hershel 2500 list, and in particular give you some of my experience with the list and hopefully give you enough information that you can make an informed decision as to whether you'd like to pursue the list yourself, and if so, then give you some tips on how to go about doing that. So just a bit of background. Of course, the list came from Sir William Hershel and his sister Caroline Hershel's work. Just an interesting fact, Hershel himself, William Hershel, was a professional musician before he became an astronomer. That's what he did for the first half of his life. He played the oboe, the violin, harpsichord, and he was also a composer. But then in midlife, I guess he had a midlife crisis and switched completely to becoming an astronomer. And the first thing he did in his role as an astronomer was to do some star surveys. So in 1779, he published a catalog of stars down to magnitude 4, and then he followed that with a catalog down to magnitude 8. And it was during that second star survey that he discovered Uranus, which of course brought him a lot of fame and also a salary from the king. He was then called the king's astronomer, and he, with that salary, really was set to become a professional astronomer. He then did a double and multiple star survey. He then got into looking for nebulae, undiscovered nebulae. In October 1783, he did his first sweep for deep sky objects. At the time he started looking for deep sky objects, there were only 138 known deep sky objects, most, of course, due to Messier. Messier had published his list just prior to that time, and Hershel was aware of Messier's list. But then over the next 19 years, William Hershel and his sister Caroline, working together, cataloged and published the locations of a total of 2,500 deep sky objects. And that is the basis of the Hershel 2500 list. So the main telescope that Hershel used was what he called his 20-foot telescope. Back then, they named their telescopes over the length. Now we would know it as an 18.7-inch f12.9 reflector. A field of view with his primary eyepiece that he used was 15 minutes, and magnification with that same eyepiece was 157 power. He used some other telescopes as well, but that was his primary one for this deep sky survey. And back then they didn't know how to coat glass with thin films of metal. And so the mirror he made himself. He was quite a good telescope maker and quite proficient. In fact, he supplemented his income from the king with making telescopes for people. And I think he made over 100 telescopes that he sold to other people. But the mirror he used back then, what they made their mirrors, it was a mixture of copper and tin that they melted and poured and created a solid metal mirror. And the reflectivity when they were new and well polished was only about 70% reflectivity, which is pretty bad from now, modern day standards, but at the time it was quite good. And if you work out what an 18.7-inch reflector would look like nowadays in terms of light gathering power, it's pretty bad. It would be quite a bit smaller. But Herschel realized that his reflectivities were not great, and he actually switched sometimes to using just a single mirror in what is now called a Herschelian design of a telescope. So he tilted his primary, and then it came to focus with no secondary outside the main end of the telescope. You actually look down to the primary mirror directly without a secondary. So then you only had one mirror. So when you work out with only one mirror versus today's Newtonian design with two mirrors, it would be equivalent to a modern day about a 17-inch telescope with, of course, 90 some odd percent reflectivity we get now. But back then, 70% reflectivity and an 18.7-inch corresponds to about a 17-inch modern day Newtonian. So still a pretty good, darn good sized telescope. At the time that Herschel was observing, the professional astronomers looked kind of down their nose at people using reflectors, because most amateurs use reflectors, and refractors were the choice of telescope by most professionals. But of course, Herschel, his rebellious nature allowed him to then build these big telescopes that he discovered more objects than anybody had ever seen at that time and since as well. So very successful with his telescopes and observing. So most of his observing was done outside what we now call Heathrow Airport, just near that location, a few kilometers away, and that's where he was living at the time. Initially, when he started his deep sky surveys, he worked alone, but he found it very time consuming to be climbing up and down his ladder. You can see a picture on the right there, or a painting of his telescope and what he was in the Herschelian design. You can see him looking down the telescope in a Herschelian design with just the one mirror. But he wasn't very successful with his attempts to find objects, because he was using a candle to record his observations every 5 minutes and wrecking his dark adaptation every 5 minutes. Things got a lot better when he hired a fellow to stand on the ground and move his telescope around, and he convinced his sister Caroline to transcribe his verbal observations. You can see this artist's rendering of his sister there down below recording his observations. So she'd be using a candle to record his observations, and he didn't have to wreck his dark adaptation or get down from his telescope. So the team then of Caroline and William discovered 1,000 new objects in the first 16 months, another 1,000 over the next few years. And by 1790, 6 years from when they started, they cataloged 2,300 new objects, averaging 330 objects per year up to that time. William really wanted to get a total of 2,500 objects, and it took them another 12 years to get that last 200 objects. And his last sweep was on September 30th, 1802, age 63 at that time, and that was 19 years from starting. So in total, the 2,500 objects that he and Caroline cataloged, they spent 401 nights observing, averaging 6.2 newly discovered objects per night. So a very, very impressive record, and it had never been equaled since. Yeah, sure. How's that? So you can go look up Herschel's original journal articles. They're published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London, and they're freely available. You can go on the web and anybody can go look these up. The problem with trying to figure out from the original journal articles is that some deciphering is needed. And there's also quite a few duplicate and non-existent objects. So they were working with paper records. Caroline and William, obviously everything was done on paper. and trying to keep track of 2,500 objects on paper. You know, did we see this one already or not? I mean, that's really difficult. So naturally, there's a few errors, amazingly few, but there are a few errors. So various people have gone through Williams' publications to try and sort out which are real objects and which are not. An interesting Canadian connection, it was really a number of Canadian astronomers who started down this road. From what I can tell, it was back in the 1950s, T.F. Morris from the Montreal RASC Center and Tom Noseworthy, together in 1958, they had observed a few hundred of Herschel's objects. And Patrick Brennan then went further down the road, another Canadian astronomer, and he had achieved observations of more than 1,000 of Herschel's objects by 1976. And Father Lucien Kemble, I know from Cochrane area, had observed many of Herschel's objects as well. So a number of Canadian astronomers were kind of the first to go down the road of repeating Herschel's observations. But it wasn't until recently that the full catalog has been carefully gone through, and Mark Bratton, another Canadian astronomer, has written a book called The Complete Guide to the Herschel Objects, published in 2011, and that lists a total of 2,435 unique deep sky objects from the list, the rest being duplicate objects or non-existent objects. And then more recently, Cliff Wygant at the Astronomical League in the US went through the list and came up with a total of 2,379 objects. And then the Herschel Society Gold Certificate is available from the Astronomical League if you observe those objects. And then finally, Wolfgang Steinecke, a German astronomer, published a book a couple of years ago, which tallies a total of 2,438 objects. So if you're going to observe the Herschel list, you have to decide whose version of the list you're going to go with, because some sources disagree on some of the objects. When John Dreyer created the NGC catalog in the late 1800s, he included all of Herschel's objects, but of course, at that point, the Herschel's list had not been really fully deciphered, and there were some duplicates and non-existent. So some of the Herschel objects don't have actually NGC numbers for that reason, and I've listed a couple of them there. So when I decided to pursue the Herschel list, this is the one I went with. I went with Steinecke's list. It has the most objects. It's the biggest list of the ones that I could find. So that's what I did. And you can see the breakdown, what you're going to be observing. If you do this list, it's basically galaxies with a handful of clusters and nebulae, but you can see 2,153 galaxies is what you're going to be tracking down, and then a handful of other objects. If you do decide to do the list, you're going to have to realize that some of these objects are quite dim. And from my count, 668 objects have visual magnitudes greater than 13.0. And the very dimmest on the list is NGC 2843, which is a visual magnitude 15.5. And that turns out to be dimmer than 90% of all the NGC objects. And if you look at the objects that were used to discover the NGC objects here, if you're going to get down to the dimmest 10%, you're talking about telescopes up in the big, on the right-hand side of this graph, 18 inches and bigger is kind of what you're looking at. So Herschel saw 2843. Some people disagree whether he actually saw it or not. I know Mark Bratton, who wrote one of the books on the Herschel objects, was unable to find it. He never did see 2843, and his biggest telescope was a 15-inch telescope. So you're going to be looking at probably some on the order of 17 or 18 inches from a dark site as well. Herschel, of course, was observing from without any light pollution, obviously. And you're going to need to get this big scope to very dark skies. We're talking Bortle 2 kind of skies. For those reasons, you need a big scope. It has to be in the middle of nowhere where there's no light pollution. And you got 2,500 objects. That's quite a few hurdles to overcome. And for that reason, not many people have completed this list. From what I can tell, I talked to Cliff Wygant at the Astronomical League, and he said that 10 people have completed the Herschel Gold Certificate. So that's observing the 2,379 objects that he compiled into the list. And then looking online, I could find 6 records of other people who have visually observed some version of Herschel's 2,500 list. So if you decide to do this list, you're going to be in very small company. My first steps with the Herschel list, I didn't ever intended at this point to observe the 2,500 objects. And if you do decide to do the list, I think this would be a good place to start. Start with the Herschel 400 list, sometimes called the Herschel 1 list. So this is 400, it's a 400 object subset of some of the brighter objects in the Herschel 2,500 list. And it turns out you don't need a very big scope. This is the scope that I use, it's 12.5-inch scope. You don't need a scope that big. In fact, Jay Freeman has observed all of them in a 55 mil scope, which I wouldn't recommend because some of them are like magnitude 11 galaxies and they're not going to look very nice in a 55 mil scope, but it can be done, at least according to Jay Freeman. The other problem you're going to encounter if you do this list, it's very loud in my ears from here, but I'll put the mic to mine closer here. The other problem you're going to encounter is some of the objects are fairly low. You can observe them all from Edmonton, but you're going to have a fairly low horizon on some of the objects. There's a handful that are quite low. So on the Herschel 400 list, NGC 3629 only gets about 4 degrees off the horizon from Edmonton. So it's going to be a pretty clean southern horizon to pick that one off. I actually happened to be in Australia and boarded a telescope when I was there on a work trip and was able to pick it up there. So you may, if you do this list, you may want to do some observing from southern skies to pick off the handful of really low objects. After you do the Herschel 400 list, if you're still not sick of the Herschel objects, the next one up is the Herschel 800 list. So this is another 400 of, again, some of the brighter Herschel 2,500 objects. And I like this drawing here of NG6814. I like how it turned out on the screen. You can't even see the object. That's kind of what it's like half the time. On the screen, I can see it just barely. Yeah, that's kind of what it looks like. Yeah, depending on the size of the scope. I think this drawing I did in a 10-inch. So on the right, you can see a 10-inch daub that I took with me to California to get some of the low-lying Herschel 800s. You're going to have to, if you get to the bottom of the last bunch of Herschel 800s, are getting quite dim by now. So you're kind of getting to the dimmer objects, at least in this 800 list. And back then, of course, we used star hopping with paper atlases, which was awful because they only go down to like magnitude 9. And the star hopping becomes very difficult because even if you get the thing in the field, you still can't see it until you actually hop within the field, which is going to be a problem if you decide to use GoTo and you punch in whatever NG6814 and it goes to it. Supposedly it's in the eyepiece, but you still can't see it. You're going to have to star hop within the eyepiece. So you're going to have to get used to doing that. You're also probably going to get very tired of the list at some point. I know I did. And you'll probably want to just blast as many as you can in one night sometimes. And occasionally I just get frustrated and I would just try and do as many as I could. And I think on this one trip to California, I went backpacking with my scope and I think I logged 115 objects in 3 nights, which back then was quite difficult because we were using paper star atlases. Now it's a lot easier with the electronic star atlases. You can probably get a lot more than that now. And the other thing that's going to probably happen is that life's going to get in the way. So with a list of 2,500 objects, it can take many years. And I actually kind of gave up on the Herschel objects for about 12 years. Various things got in the way, as life often does to us. Things happen. But primarily the reason I stopped observing the Herschel list was because I knew I couldn't get them all in my 12.5-inch scope. Some of the dimmer objects are just beyond that size of telescope. And so, yeah, I'm not even going to bother with Herschels anymore. So I kind of switched to observing from various catalogs, some of the brighter, new to me NGCs that I hadn't seen before, doing some southern sky observing, and then just kind of getting distracted with other things. But if you do the Herschel 2,500 list, one thing you might want to do, or even if you do some of the smaller Herschel lists, the Herschel 400, Herschel 800, one thing you might want to do is visit Herschel's home in Bath. So there is the home that he lived in when he was in Bath, when he discovered Uranus, is still there. And you can go into the backyard and you can actually stand where Herschel discovered Uranus, which is kind of cool. And you can see the flagstones there have marks on them from where he mist when he was pouring some of the metal. It's kind of cool. You can see in some of his telescopes that he was making. If you have musical ability, another thing you might want to try is following down some of Herschel's musical footsteps. So as I said, Herschel was a musician before he became an astronomer. And so you can go and if you have musical ability, play some of his compositions, which is something I was fortunate enough to be able to do. I was able to perform a couple of his oboe concertos. I happen to be an amateur oboe player, so that's kind of cool to follow his footsteps in that regard. But I got quite distracted by shooting nightscapes. These sure show very dark on the screen. And then I got into bi-marathons, which really took a lot of time away from my observing. This is a really harebrained idea. I don't know who thought this one up, but this is where you observe 110 deep sky objects in one night, like a Messier marathon. But you also run a full running marathon on one night. So that took a lot of time but you get really good at star hopping, and your astronomy chops get very well tuned, because you have to be really fast at finding all the objects, right, to fit a marathon and a Messier marathon in one night. I also did one in Australia using the Bennett list. Now that's another list if you haven't done. It's pretty cool. It's 150 some objects, like the Messier list, but it's for southern sky. That's a fun list to do. So I did the 110 of the Bennett list with then bi-marathon version, running a marathon. And you can see what that did to my observing. This is a plot of the number of NGCs I had observed over time. I don't have a plot like this for the Herschel objects, but all the Herschels are basically in the NGC catalog for the most part. So it's kind of a measure of how I was going with the Herschel list. You can see the starting at 0 and doing the Herschel 400, the Herschel 800, and then there's this big gap. And that's when I got distracted with various other things and didn't really observe. And that's probably going to happen to you if you do the Herschel 2500. It's not really a linear process. At some point, you're going to get tired of it and do other things. But then I came back to it, as you can see, the big slope at the end there, where I just got serious about finishing the dang thing. So it was in May 2020, after the pandemic had hit, had time to sit down and realize that I had hit 2,000 NGCs. I'd observed 2,000 NGCs by this point, and I thought, well, I must have observed most of the Herschel 2500 by now. But when I did the calculations, it turned out I wasn't even halfway there. Fortunately, the pandemic was in full rage, and I had lots of time in the evenings, nothing happening. And I happened to move to an acreage with Bortle 3 skies in my backyard. So I started picking off what I could of the Herschel list in my 12.5-inch scope. And occasionally I would go out to Black Nugget with the 18-inch scope out there and started picking off some of the dimmer ones. But if you do the Herschel 2500 list, you're going to have to deal with the fact that about 25% of the list is really very quite dim, and you're going to need a big scope. So something like an 18-inch scope. Not only do you need an 18-inch scope or something like it, but it's got to be at a pretty dark site. I found the very dimmest NGC 2843. The best view I had of it was in Arizona with an 18-inch, and I tried an 18-inch. Actually, it was a couple of years. I tried an 18-inch in Arizona. Previously, couldn't see it. I tried it with a 22-inch here under Bortle 3 skies. Couldn't see it, and I did get it with the 18-inch in Arizona. I also did eventually see it in Edmonton with a 22-inch, but some of these objects really, really dim. You're going to have to use it for division. You guys know most of this stuff about how to observe really dim things. You know, you need really dark skies. Snow cover here is a real problem because it really boosts the light pollution, really increases the night sky brightness. So like I said, I made a couple trips to Arizona to use an 18-inch where there's no snow, nice dark ground, gives you really pristine skies. I also found bad transparency was really interfered with some of the dim objects. You know, the aerosol in the air blocks the light coming in from the objects, and they're just not visible, these dim ones. So you got to wait for good nights of good transparency. And then, of course, any lights of any kind kill your dark adaptation, as Herschel noted. So with these dim objects, you really do have to shut off flash sites, dim your tablets, put ruby lith on them. You really have to be observing dark adaptation, or you're not going to see them. You know, close your eyes, your observing eye anytime any artificial light is turned on. Cover your eye for up to 30 minutes after any light exposure. And multiple attempts. So some of the objects just take several tries, waiting for the right skies, the right darkness, the biggest scope you can get. And even then, just sitting there trying to see it for, 10 or 20 minutes till your eyes get dark enough. So it's a challenge to get these last really dim ones. So all told, it took me 2 years. If you do decide to list, I'm sure if you do decide to do the list yourself, I'm sure you can do it quicker than that. Because like I said, I had a 12-year hiatus there. I don't actually know how many nights it took because I didn't keep track for that 12-year period of Herschel objects. And I was looking at some NGCs, which were probably on the Herschel list, but something on the order of 300 nights is probably what it took me. Sometimes if you do this list, like I said, you're going to get tired of the list. The list gets really monotonous at some point. So you're probably going to want to bang off as many objects as you can in one night. My record for my one night of crazy observing, trying to get as many of these done as I could, was on March 16th this year when I observed 110 of them, 102 of which were new to me. These were the kind of the last dregs of the Herschel list. And it was getting really dull looking at the most dimmest galaxies I could possibly see. So I knocked off a bunch that one night. So there I am celebrating April 16th this year, observing the last of the Herschel object. So if I had to rate the list, I'd probably give it a 2 stars out of 5. And that's not really a comment on Herschel. I mean, any list of 2,500 deep sky objects is probably going to be 2 stars out of 5 because, after you get past the first few hundred objects, everything is just a dim galaxy for the most part. That's just the way the deep sky is. So I would say it's certainly of interest to historians, but it's not really a curated amateur astronomy list. Still, it's pretty cool to observe what Herschel saw. Another Canadian connection to Herschel, though, if you do the Herschel 2500 list, this is on the must-do list, you should get yourself to Herschel, Saskatchewan. So I discovered this by serendipity. I was in the town of Handel, Saskatchewan at a funeral, and I was looking on a map, figuring out how to get home, good old paper maps, and I saw this town called Hershel nearby. It was like 50 kilometers away. And I was like, what is that? And so I looked it up on the web and it's like, sure enough, it's named after Sir William Herschel. So there's this remote little rural town in Saskatchewan that you need to go visit if you're going to do the Herschel list. Another Canadian connection, there's a surprising number of Canadian connections to Herschel. Some of you may have heard of the clothing company called the Hershel Supply Company. You can buy toques that say Herschel across the front of them, and backpacks that say Herschel, which is kind of cool. That clothing company is named after the town of Herschel because the grandparents of the people who started the company came from Herschel, Saskatchewan. So indirectly, the Herschel Clothing Company is named after Sir William Herschel. Kind of another Canadian connection. So if you do decide or are thinking of doing the Herschel 2500 list, one thing I think you should decide is whether you want to do maybe a more appropriate modern list of 2500 objects. I mean, maybe the thing for you is to follow in Herschel's footsteps. So then you should do the Herschel 2500 list. But if all you want to do is observe 2500 deep sky objects, then a more appropriate list, in my view, would be, say, all the NGC objects that are declination greater than -22. So that would mean the lowest objects you'd ever have to look at is 15 degrees off the horizon. Because one of the problems with the Herschel 2500 list is you're going to have to be observing stuff that's just a few degrees off the horizon, dim galaxies that are a few degrees off the horizon, which is not very fun. And then let's keep the visual magnitude greater than 13.0. When you put those criterion in and sort the NGC objects, you find 2,514 objects. And then realizing that not all the NGCs have visual magnitudes known to them, you can go through all the 120 NGCs that don't have known visual magnitudes that are greater than -22 declination and pick out the best ones, which is what I did, ones that I had observed and felt were worthy of looking at, and then put that into the list. Take out the lowest down, dimmest objects of the 2,514, and you come up with a total of 2,500 objects, which I call the brightest northern NGCs. So 1,651 of those are Herschel 2500s, but then there's 787 that are brighter than the Herschel objects and not as low down. And that would be what I would suggest if you're going to do just 2,500 deep sky objects. If you're going to do the NGC, brightest NGCs, it's interesting to have a bit of history. knowledge on the NGC list is a total of 100 observers that created the NGCs or discovered the NGCs, and they were all discovered visually. So you're in good company if you're a visual observer. All the NGCs were discovered by visual observers, except for one. I think it's NGC 1432, the Maya Nebula, was discovered photographically. But 60% of the NGCs were discovered by amateur astronomers with private observatories. You can see the size of the telescopes. I've noted that before, but here you can see on the right here, it shows the little black symbols are refractors and the triangles are reflectors. And those are all the telescopes that were used to discover the NGCs. Most of them were refractors. And as Robert mentioned, at the time that the NGCs, before the early 1900s, they didn't know what they were looking at. And they didn't know if these were unresolved stars or the gaseous nebulae. And that wasn't known, as Robert mentioned, until the 1920s. Reliable data on all the NGCs that amateur astronomers can use wasn't really compiled and available online until the late 1990s. 2.3% of the original NGCs are actually non-existent. So if you're going to use the NGC list, you got to realize that a lot of them, well, not a lot, but a fraction of those there's nothing there. And of the total of 7,840 NGC labels, only 7,064 are actually unique non-stellar objects. And if you're thinking, oh, I should do the full NGC list, and I'll be the first to do it. Sorry, it's been done already. Steve Gottlieb, I think in 2019, finished observing all of the NGC objects. So, but the brightest 2500 is there for you if you want. You can go to that website and you can observe that if you'd prefer not to go looking down for the very horizon-hugging Herschel objects. Just a comparison of the two lists then. So you can see on the left, the Herschel 2500, on the right, the brightest 2500 northern NGCs. Everything I think I've mentioned here. The dimmest Herschel is magnitude 15.5. Dimmest northern NGC magnitude 13. That's deceptive, of course. It's still the brightest 2500 is not an easy list because, of course, magnitude alone does not determine how difficult it is to see an object. Surface brightness plays a role, right? So some of these are still quite dim. I know NGC 6822, Bernard's Galaxy, is one of the brightest 2500 northern NGCs, but it's still not an easy object. But you don't have to go looking real close to the horizon. So the lowest objects are still 15 degrees off the horizon from Edmonton versus the Herschels, which are down at like 4 degrees off the horizon for some of them. The mix of objects between the two lists is still pretty similar. You're still looking at a whole bunch of galaxies with a mix, small mix of other objects. So probably still just a 2-star rating out of 5 for the brightest 2500 northern NGCs, but that's just the reality of the deep, deep sky. So I'd like to just close by saying that observing the Herschel 2500 or the brightest 2500 objects is something that really is worth considering. It keeps you observing. It gets you out of your chair some nights when you might have otherwise just sat there and watched a movie on Netflix. So having a list, whether it's a Herschel 2500 or the brightest 2500 NGCs, or there's many other lists out there that you could do. I think the Astronomical League has like more than 80 lists you can choose from. RASC Handbook has a whole bunch of lists. Maybe you don't want to observe 2500 objects, but you can pick off some other list. And maybe you're thinking, well, I don't have an 18-inch scope at a dark site. I can't do the Herschel 2500 list. Well, Black Nugget Lake has an 18-inch sitting there, which you could observe and which has been used to pick off some of the very low-lying Herschels. And of course, the very dimmest objects might be difficult at an 18-inch at Black Nugget, like NGC 2843, but we have a 32-inch out there. So every one of the Herschel 2500s can be observed from Black Nugget Lake. So perhaps maybe in 10 or 20 years from now, one of you will be standing up here and telling us how you observed every one of the Herschel 2500s from Black Nugget Lake. And I look forward to that day. Thanks very much.
I think we can have time for 1 or 2 quick questions. Anyone? Shortest distance.
Did you do a lot of this in the winter or the fall?
Both. So fall, winter, spring, obviously not summer because can't really observe here in the summer for deep sky objects. Yeah.
Okay, what's your next list?
Actually, I'm still finishing the brightest 2500. I got a few left. So I'm working on that one right now. There's no shortage of lists.
Okay, we've got time for one more.
This is a quickie. You had the graph showing the size of the telescopes and their limiting aperture, and the biggest and their limiting magnitude. The biggest telescope didn't have as good a magnitude as the second biggest telescope.
Yeah, it's probably just, I mean, these are old, these are back in the 1800s. So it could have been just
Speculum mirror.
yeah, speculum versus, I don't know what, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that, Warren. Very
You're welcome.
impressive.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I would like to ask Mark Selchuk to come on up.
Greetings from Berta Beltran and I, co-librarians at the club library, which can be found, if you're going down that way, just turn to the left once you exit the doors. Maybe you've noticed that there's some books on the ledge there. I've put some out of circulation because of space challenges within the library, and I've seen quite a few books have already been taken, so thank you very much. The book of the month for this month is Transiting Exoplanets. And it was donated by Luca Vanzella. An exoplanet is a planet orbiting a star other than our sun. The great entertainer Liberace claimed to have an exoplanet circling around him, but this was never scientifically proven. In Transiting Exoplanets by Carol A. Haswell, the methods used in the detection and characterization of exoplanets are presented through the study of transiting systems in this unique textbook for advanced undergraduates. From determining the atmospheric properties of transiting exoplanets to measuring the planetary orbit's alignment with the stellar spin, students will discover that these measurements imply for reinvigorated theories of planet formation and evolution. The book is completely self-contained, unlike Liberace, with numerous worked examples and exercises. So the book's available immediately after the meeting if you're interested. Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mark. All right, now as our final feature, we have Abdur and our Astro Imaging Corner.
Awesome. Thank you, Jay. Okay, let's get started. Just going to share my screen here. Okay, can anyone confirm if they can see my screen?
We can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so welcome to Astro Imaging Corner number 129. For anyone joining us for the first time, this is the part of the meeting where I share images sent in by our members. And if you want to send in some images, you can send them to Astro Imaging Corner at edmontonrasc.com. And that's also listed on the RASC Edmonton webpage. The first image today is from Craig Sherris, and this is the Western Veil Nebula, and also known as the Witch's Broom Nebula. It's a segment of the Veil Nebula cataloged as NGC 6960. And it's called the Witch's Broom because of the shape, which resembles the sweeping end of a broomstick. This was taken with a stellar view SVX 130 refractor on a software Visk Paramount MX mount and using a Player One Poseidon C camera. And Craig was using an Optolong L Ultimate filter for this one, and this is a total of 6 hours of exposures. So excellent job with the processing there, Craig. Up next, another one from Craig. This is the Eastern Veil Nebula. And again, has some beautiful, intricate filaments and knots in the dust and gas. And I personally love observing this one through large Dobsonians. And this is comprised of ionized gas, which emits light at specific wavelengths, and dust, which absorbs light and causes the structure to appear dark in some areas. And the structure is approximately 110 light years across, and it's expanding at a rate of about 600 kilometers per second. And the supernova explosion that created this is thought to have been a type 2 supernova, which is where a very massive star explodes. And the resulting explosion sends shock waves throughout the surrounding gas and dust, which can trigger the formation of new stars. Again, this was taken with the same 130 millimeter refractor. So absolutely beautiful detail, especially in that bat region in the center. Okay, up next we have an image from Hans. This is the Cygnus Wall. And this was taken recently from Sherwood Park from a Bortle 7 backyard with an Edge HD 9.25 at f7. And this is 90 minutes of total exposure with an Optolong L Extreme filter. And it was processed in Cyril and GIMP. So great shot there, Hans. Up next, we have another one from Hans. This is Messier 13, and this was taken over 3 nights in May. And this is a total of 478 minutes of exposure using only a UV IR cut filter. And the shorter exposure times help avoid overexposing the center. And this was shot with an ASI 2600 MC Pro camera through the same Edge HD 9.25 at f7. And this was processed in Cyril and GIMP, and a little bit of Topaz, Denoise AI, and Infran View. So absolutely beautiful job, and I love that that faint galaxy near the bottom, and that tiny one halfway to the cluster. Absolutely beautiful. And up next, another one from Hans. This is the Cat's Eye Nebula, and this is one of the famous pictures by the Hubble Space Telescope showing the intricate region in the center, which showed up very nicely here. And this was again with the same equipment as before, but with an IDAS LPS D3 filter. And this was only about 80 minutes worth of 2.5 minute exposures. And Hans says the outer nebulosity is not that impressive, but he's quite happy with how detailed the bright core came out. And perhaps it's a good candidate to try drizzling on this one. I would definitely say so. Yeah, that would be a great candidate. And the last one from Hans, I forgot to change the title. This is Messier 101, of course. That's the one with the recent supernova. And again, same equipment as before, but with a UV IR cut filter. And this was taken over 5 nights from May 24 to 28 to see if the brightness of the supernova changes during the time by taking the brightness ratio to, or by comparing the brightness ratio to foreground stars. But Hans says he couldn't make out significant variation within the measurement error, and therefore he decided to just combine all of the frames together into 1 hour, one image of 12 hours. And I think the supernova was bright for quite a long time, so I think you need a bit longer time to see variation in brightness on that one, but it's a beautiful image. Up next, we have one from Tom Owen. This is Messier 81 and 82, the 2 gravitationally interacting galaxies, about 11.8 million light years away. And Messier 81 on the left is a grand design spiral, and Messier 82 on the right is the peculiar galaxy. And it's also known as the exploding cigar galaxy for obvious reasons. And the gravitational force exerted by M81 on it is causing a huge rate of star formation and gas expulsion. And this was a total of 5 hours of exposure time using LRGB and hydrogen alpha filters. And this was taken over 2 nights in August at Pigeon Lake. And Tom was using his Takahashi TSA 120 scope at f7.5 and his trusty QSI 683 CCD camera. And Tom said the skies were smoky, the filters were dusty, and the flats didn't take. But all in all, he's satisfied with the results. So, as you should be, Tom. I think they look great. And this was stacked in APP and processed using Star Tools. So thank you for sharing. Up next is an older image from Tom. This is from last time. So this is NGC 3953 and NGC 3917. And Tom said he managed to image a small part of Ursa Major. This is a part of the Ursa Major galaxy cluster, and you can actually see a couple of fainter background galaxies there as well. And Tom said, unlike the famous Virgo cluster, the Ursa Major cluster consists mostly of spiral galaxies. Tom counted 12 galaxies in this image, but there could be more or less. Tom said he had little confidence in his ability to discern those things. And these particular galaxies are found to the south of Phecda, the southernmost star in the bowl of the Big Dipper. And this was imaged using LRGB filters. The total exposure time was 2 hours and 25 minutes using the same Takahashi TSA 120 scope. And the subs were stacked in the newly released version of Deep Sky Stacker and processed using Star Tools. And the field of view has been cropped by about 25%. Awesome job, Tom. Thank you. Up next, we have a GIF or a time lapse from Murray Paulson. And Murray said it was an awful summer for astrophotography, so he's sharing his picture of the eclipse. And this was with the William Optics GT71 in Exmouth, Australia, from Murray's last trip there. So beautiful job. Up next, we have another image, and this time it's of the sun's chromosphere, which Murray says he thought it would make a great movie. So using PIPP, he managed to get it out. And this was shot with a Canon ATD and the William Optics GT71. And all shots were 1/8000th of a second at ISO 800. But the images, turned out very, very well and absolutely beautiful. Up next is another shot from Murray Paulson, and this is the crescent of Venus using an AP130 refractor and a 2x Barlow and Murray's ASI 290MC color camera. And Murray took about 5,000 frames of video and stacked the best 20% of them, and then did the final processing in Registacks. So very nice. Up next is Venus as a full disk, and this is from July 2022. And at this point, Venus was 3.9 degrees away from the sun. So you can see the contrast in the size between when Venus is a crescent and when it's a full disk. It's so much larger as a crescent, and that's when it happens to be at its brightest. Up next, we have an image from Professor Brian Martin. And this is an image of the famous grain elevators at Rowley with the Milky Way in the background. And this was a tracked panorama of 6 panels. Each panel was 2 minutes and 3 subs each. And this was with a Canon 6D ISO 800 and a 24mm Samyang f4 lens. Very, very nice. Up next, this is Milky Way from the Tolman Bridge campground east of Trochu. And as with the Rowley image, Calgary is about 100 kilometers away and creates a lot of light pollution. And this is actually a 17-panel panorama, and it was tracked. Then this was using a vintage 50mm Pentax lens at f2.8 on a Canon 6D, again ISO 800. And the 50mm lens brings out an amazing amount of detail in the Milky Way. So again, absolutely beautiful. Up next, another nightscape from Brian. This is the Milky Way over Red Rock Coulee, just south of Medicine Hat. And this is a tracked 9-panel shot taken under very windy conditions. And again, with the Canon 6D and 14mm f4. Well, I'm gonna have to reach out to you for some of these locations, Brian. I don't know how you find them. I need to get out there. Absolutely beautiful. And the last one from Brian, this is from just south of Drumheller. And this is a panorama of 9 panels with the Canon 6D and 24mm lens. And this was stitched together in ICE, which is, I think it's made by Microsoft. It's a panorama program, and processed in PixInsight and Photoshop. And Brian said he's happy with the result considering we are in perpetual twilight. Well, that's very true. And actually, this is the last one from Brian. This is the sun in hydrogen alpha, sodium, and hydrogen beta. And this is from May 24. Yeah, beautiful contrast using the different filters. Up next, we have an image from Alan Hobbs. This is Messier 20. Also, Alan, your most recent image that you sent in, I couldn't access that, so you might have to give me access to that Google Drive folder. So I'm using your previous images from last time, as I didn't get a chance to show them previously. So again, this is the Trifid Nebula, which is a hydrogen region in the northwest of the constellation of Sagittarius. And it was discovered by Charles Messier in 1764, and its name means three lobe. And this object is an unusual combination of open cluster, an emission nebula with the relatively dense reddish pink portion, and a reflection nebula, which is mainly the bluish portion, and a dark nebula, which is the apparent gaps near the center. And this was taken in New Mexico near Silver City in April 2022. And this is a total of 15 subs of 180 seconds each. So a total exposure time of 45 minutes. And it was shot using Nina and a Celestron Edge HD 8 scope with a 0.7 focal reducer and Allen's ASI 2600 MC camera, and processed in PixInsight and Photoshop. Amazing job. Up next, another one from Alan. This is the open cluster Messier 7, sometimes also known as Ptolemy's cluster. And this is in the constellation of Scorpius. And this was again taken in New Mexico near Silver City. And this was a total of only 20 minutes of integration time. So it shows you what you can do from a dark sky, because to get detail like that over here would take maybe 3 hours. So beautiful shot. And same equipment, Edge HD 8 with a 0.7 reducer and the ASI 2600 MC camera. And one more from Alan. This is Messier 61, and it's known as an intermediate barred spiral galaxy. It's in the Virgo cluster. And also in the photo, you can see NGC 4301, 4292, 4292A, and two other smaller PGC galaxies. And this was taken at the same location as last time with the same equipment. And this is a total of 60 minutes of exposure time. And the last image of the night, I didn't actually have an image to share, so I just put in one of my in-progress shots. This is the Andromeda Galaxy. And I had previously taken an image of the Andromeda Galaxy as well that I was very happy with, but I decided to go all out and redo that, which I'll try not to do in the future. And I decided to get 10 times as much data as my previous image. And this is only in hydrogen alpha to highlight some of the nebulae in the arms of the Andromeda Galaxy. And you can see a lot of very large regions of hydrogen alpha gas there. And our first speaker had spoken about Cepheid variable V1 in the Andromeda Galaxy, which was the star that Edwin Hubble has used to calculate the distance to the Andromeda Galaxy. And yeah, that's easily visible in the full-size image, which has been cropped to a tiny section here. But yeah, I'll be sharing the full image in the next meeting. I just want to say thank you to everyone who sent in some images, and I included the images from last time when we did not have an astro imaging corner. So if I missed anything, just send me a message, and if there were any errors in here, I apologize for that. I'm using a new version of PowerPoint, so that caused some complications. So back to you, Jay.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay. All right. Thanks, Frank. And thanks, Abdur. So yeah, just again, reminder, Northern Prairie Star Party starts tomorrow and runs through till Sunday. We have our What's Up Over Edmonton Wednesday, October 4th, put on by Jeff Robertson. And again, very informative and entertaining. So if you have time, take a look at that or join that. Observers Group, John Stolte and Berta Beltran. On the 11th, we have Richard Covey doing an astro imaging cafe on Wednesday, October 18th. These are all Zoom, by the way. And our next, just a note that our next monthly meeting is the 16th. So it's pushed back by 1 week. So with that, I would like to thank our guest speakers again, Robert Smith and Warren Finlay, for their very informative and interesting topics today. And I thank everyone for coming out. And with that, clear skies to everyone and good night.